So now let's talk about where the scientific field has gone in cognitive research and how we kind of started getting away from this idea of dualism and started getting kind of farther in these two realms, the dual aspect theory and reductionism. Something I forgot to mention last episode, or last video episode, last video was that these two are in the scientific community widely regarded as still possible, right? So dual aspect theory is still very much a thing, and I'll talk a lot about that once we get to consciousness towards the end of the 7 weeks. Okay, so one of the first times in which the scientific field saw that the brain has a lot to do with the mind, so rather than having them completely separate, as in dualism, showing that the brain actually has something to do with the mind, was Thomas Willis. So Thomas Willis was a clinician. He was interested in neurology, so he was kind of interested in the brain. And he was the first who linked brain damage with cognitive dysfunction. So before this, any sort of pathology, neuropathology, such as schizophrenia or depression or ADD, anything like that was thought to have come from something religious. So kind of like demons or something like that. And so to say that these neuropathologies were actually coming from something physical was a really big deal at the time. So what he did is he followed one individual who had a severe retardation, congenital mental retardation, and he took notes on their behavior. So he compared his behavior from a healthy individual, one who did not have this dysfunction, and someone who has a pathology, and then did a post-mortem autopsy and found that their brains were very different. Because this individual had very severe mental retardation, their brain had actually had a lot of atrophy. So a lot of the actual brain mass had actually atrophied and the ventricles had kind of taken over the space. So it was very obvious visually, and he did some really nice sketches, and these are kind of the first sketches showing that the brain is actually where a lot of these dysfunctions are coming from. And that's a big deal because now we know that they're treatable, right? It's something that we can actually treat because it's something physical. So really, really profound discovery back in the 17th century. And then fast forward to the 19th century, now we're starting to talk about phrenology. So if you haven't heard of phrenology, this is the idea that the bumps on the skull can be used to tell what your personality is like and how good you'll be at different behaviors and that sort of thing. So Franz Gall was kind of the inventor of phrenology. I should say real quick, I will never test you on dates. I just wanted to give you dates so that you kind of have an idea of order as far as history goes. And so Franz Gall came up with this idea that different mental functions, if you use them more, then they will grow. Or if you're really good at something, that brain region that is associated with that function is going to be larger than functions that you're not good at, right? So I'm personally, I don't know, what am I good at? I like to drum, right? So I'm a percussionist. So the part of my brain that is involved in percussion, right, is larger than something like piano, which I have no experience with. So that would be much smaller. Hopefully that makes sense there. And so these increases in brain for the functions that we're good at would actually lead to bumps on the skull, right? Because larger bumps or larger brain region must push the skull out. Therefore, you'll be able to detect them from feeling the skull itself, right? And so here is an example of one of the phrenologist's ideas where, like, if you have a bump above your ear, you have more prudence. If you have a bump over here, you like to imitate people. You're a witty person if you have a bump over here, that sort of thing. I should say that this is, of course, not true. The reason I'm bringing up is because this is an extremely important idea for psychology. And the reason for that is this is the first time that someone proposed that different brain regions might lead to different cognitive functions, might be involved in different cognitive functions, right? So these aren't true as far as which brain region is doing what. But what was true about phrenology was that different functions are being done in different parts of the brain. So this is what we call localizationism. Localizationism is when different parts of the brain are involved in different functions, right? So like I said earlier, HM had damage in the medial temporal lobe, which impaired his memory, suggesting that that brain area must be involved in memory somehow, right? While other brain regions like the cortex in the back, the occipital lobe, is largely involved in vision, right? So that's what I mean by different functions in different brain regions. That's the idea of localizationism. And that really came about in the 19th century through phrenology. So it was good, right? Different mental functions are localized to different brain regions. But you can't actually find this out through bumps on the skull. The bumps on the skull really have nothing to do with cognition at all. It kind of got weird, right? Phrenology got weird, where some people were not allowed to have babies. Some women were not allowed to reproduce because they didn't have the right bumps on their skull, right? You had to have this big bump in the back of your head to be a good mother. If you didn't, you'd be a bad mother, therefore you shouldn't have babies. So there was ugly parts to it, of course, but it has had a large impact on the field, just as far as the idea that different brain regions are involved in different functions. Okay, so what is the opposite of localizationism, right? That's a theory in itself. Localizationism is the theory that different brain regions are involved in different functions. Holism is the opposite idea, where a perfect holistic idea is that the entire brain is involved in every function. So the person who was most involved in this theory was Florenz, or most involved in the first coming up with this theory of holism was Pierre Florenz, and he studied bird brains. So he believed that the whole brain participants in each behavior, and his evidence for this theory was that no matter where he lesioned a bird's brain, the bird could recover, and they didn't have any select deficits, right? So if they put a cut on the right side of the brain in a bird, there was no significant difference in the deficit compared to cuts on the left side of the brain. So holism, again, is the idea that the whole brain participates in each behavior. So no matter where you make a cut, the same deficit should come out because the whole brain is involved in every function. This particular example is no longer true. We do know that select lesions or damage to different brain regions do show select deficits even in the bird brain. It's likely that his lesions were just quite large, and so he was getting a severe deficit across the board no matter where he cut, something like that. But that is kind of where this idea came from. Okay, so localizationism came back. So holism was this idea that the whole brain is involved, and Florenz showed some nice data showing that that must be true. So to kind of combat that, there were some really interesting studies in the late 1800s from Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke, who were both neurologists, and they were looking at neuropathologies, or they were looking at case studies, basically. They were following individuals who had really severe retardation or pathologies in some cases, and doing post-mortem autopsies, so once the individual passed away, looking at their brain and seeing if there's any damage to any specific regions. And so they did find that. So Paul Broca in 1861, found that individuals who have damage to this area of the brain, it's kind of between the frontal and temporal or parietal cortices towards the temporal lobe down here. If you have a lesion in this area, you are unable to produce speech. That is the only deficit you seem to have. The rest of your intelligence seems to be intact. Your memory seems to be intact. Everything seems to be fine, except you are unable to produce speech. And interestingly, you are still able to understand someone speaking to you, right? Whereas on the other hand, Carl Wernicke found an individual, a patient or a case study in which this person could no longer produce speech, could no longer comprehend speech. So Paul Broca, lesion in this area, they cannot produce speech. Carl Wernicke found an area of the brain back here in the temporal lobe, where if you lesion this area, you cannot understand speech. You cannot comprehend speech. Okay, so these two papers coming out were really good evidence for localizationism, right? This is a really good example of localizationism, where if you damage this part of the brain, then you cannot produce speech. That means that this area of the brain has to be involved in that function. It's localized to that function. Whereas if you damage Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe, you can no longer comprehend speech. So Wernicke's area is involved in comprehension, speech comprehension, or language comprehension. And so really good example of evidence for localizationism. Okay, so some more evidence for localizationism came from a neurosurgeon called Wilder Penfield. Excuse me, my voice. So he was a neurosurgeon looking at epilepsy, and he was trying to find different brain regions that were involved in epilepsy. And the way that he was doing that, and the way that it's still done, was that you'll open up the skull and insert electrodes into different regions of the brain. The really nice thing about that is that there are no pain receptors in your brain. There's no pain, right, for messing with the brain. And so you can open up the skull with anesthesia, because of course you have pain receptors on your skull. You open it up, but then you can actually, once you've anesthetized the region, you can keep the patient awake while you stimulate different parts of the brain, which is a really amazing way to investigate different regions for epilepsy, of course, but also to research cognition. So he stimulated different brain tissues, and he found some really interesting things that the participants were doing, or that these epileptic patients were doing. So he found that if he stimulated along a particular area of the brain, he could actually make them move different brain regions or different body parts, right? So if I stimulate up here, I might move my arm, but if I stimulate down here, I might move my leg. So this is a huge idea. So he's the one who developed this idea of a motor homunculus, which I'll be talking about in just a moment. But he's the one who discovered that different body parts are mapped to different parts of the brain, right? So there are different parts of your brain that are involved in the movement and sensation of different body parts. Different parts of the brain involved in the motion and sensation for different body parts. So that is really, really important for localizationism, right? That's a really classic example of how a particular brain region, right? One brain region is involved in the movement of one limb, is involved in one function, is really strong support for localizationism. So who wins? From then, we've done a lot of research, and we found out that kind of both wins. Everybody wins, yay. So both were partially right. There's definitely specific processes in different localized brain regions. So yes, absolutely, localizationism is partly true, but there are some functions that are carried out by many brain regions, and some that might involve the entire brain. So holism kind of works to a point, and it just really depends on the function. If I'm looking at moving a body part, that's very, very localized. But if I'm looking at conscious awareness, that seems to be much more holistic. A lot of brain regions are interacting to give us the ability to have a conscious experience. So that's kind of the result for this debate. Okay, and so that's it for localizationism versus holism, and that's it for the historical perspective. So this is my cat Daisy. This is just kind of the ending for this sequence. The next thing we'll be talking about, probably in the next tab over on the module, we will be talking about the methods in which we study the brain. Exciting stuff, right? All right, talk to you soon.